Welcome to the J29 podcast, hosting conversations for American pastors about politics and culture in their preaching, discipleship, and mentoring. Visit j29coalition.com for more information.
Pastors have a really difficult job in today's political and cultural environment. There's a pressure to respond to salient issues, and they're kind of in a lose-lose situation. If they do respond, they can alienate people in the congregation. If they don't respond, they alienate people in the congregation.
Daniel, I need your help. I've got folks in my life. I'm a pastor, some folks in the congregation I serve. And one bundle of folks will say, ooh, we saw this really spicy thing in the news. And they're feeling feelings about it. Then I've got another group of people who say, we saw this spicy thing in the news. And it's almost like they're polar opposites with polar opposite feelings. Does seem to be the same event or same bit. And then there's this stuff about like people are getting angry about a thing I don't actually think exists, but they're being told that it exists. So Daniel, what is going on?
Well, the people in your congregation are both, or those camps are both probably right, that they saw these stories from supposedly reputable news sources of information. And, a lot of it comes back to how these stories are portrayed, how they're talked about, how they're presented to their audience. Folks who study media and partisanship and media and politics specifically talk a lot about priming and framing in terms of how these stories are portrayed. So that's not really anything new. You look at any salient or controversial news topic, and you're bound to get at least a few different spins on that topic. The difficulty, I think, comes when you start to have folks say, well, I saw this online, or I saw this from a source that I trust. And like you were saying, I'm much not sure that this actually happened or that this existed in a particular way. How do you confront that in a way that honors truth, but also respects the person with whom you're having the conversation and maintains that relationship? And that's where the difference between, media spin, media framing, and just outright misinformation or even disinformation, that's where those contrasts get even more stark.
Okay. What is the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
Really, it comes back to the motive behind it. So misinformation could just be something that's wrong, or something that's mistaken, something that's presented and shared without being verified, and it turns out it's incorrect or it didn't actually happen. Disinformation usually has a more sinister motive behind it. So it could be an actor or a group or even a government sharing information that is known to be false or known to be created for the sake of causing division or creating a narrative, and then propped up by those actors or even foreign governments intentionally. So we see this on social media a lot, where you'll have edited photos or manipulated transcripts, manipulated videos even, that's deliberately shared by actors for the purpose of manipulating and misleading an audience, maybe even for the purpose of causing division in a community. So that's disinformation, sharing information actively known to be false for the purpose of spreading division. Misinformation is just wrong information that people might be spreading unwittingly without maybe the sinister motive behind it.
Okay. And like when I remember being at the grocery store, and there were these pieces of paper that were bound together with pictures on the front, and some people call them tabloids.
Wow.
And they would say things like, woman gives birth to bat.
Yes.
Or something like that. So Is that disinformation?
There's usually, there's usually in disinformation campaigns a more overt political motive. Stuff in the National Enquirer is false, or allegedly false.
According to you.
Not to disparage the tabloids. I remember those days fondly as a kid, seeing the headlines. So that might be more of a case of, I don't know if it would rise to the same level as disinformation that we're talking about in the context of today. But you could have some overlap there at some point. So if a tabloid story is running something about, Donald Trump has only 3 months to live, according to, a leaked doctor's report.
Right.
Assuming that report doesn't exist and it was totally made up, that could be a form of disinformation. But it just could be,
Like gossip or like
gossip or lying, or I don't know how you would classify tabloid journalism, honestly, other than just kind of trashy news content. But Bat Boy is a great example. Aliens living among us.
yeah.
I think scholars of media and disinformation, misinformation would usually identify a more intentionally political motivation behind disinformation for the purpose, again, of causing division among people.
So there does seem to be an agreement, an unspoken agreement with the tabloid and the consumer, a wink and a nudge. We're a tabloid, like
Right.
we're similar to maybe satirical, like Mad Magazine
Or The Onion.
The Onion would be a great example. Like it's by its form, it's telling you that we're not reliable, like as your source of information. But if somebody fabricated some sort of like dossier or official looking report to intentionally deceive for political gain, that squarely fits in the disinformation.
Yeah, and if particularly that information is then given to or leaked to more reputable, or maybe even the appearance of reputable news sources, disseminated, and then reported on and make its way into mainstream consumption, that would be a really good example of disinformation. And we've seen that at different points in not just American history, but around the world. The government's trying to manipulate the media to cover or report on stories or events in ways that are favorable to the government's narrative. I think you're exactly right, though, with the National Enquirer or World News or whatever it is, Global News or something, that there is kind of a wink and a nod to it. Like, this is entertainment. Like, what you're getting with this. The Onion, I think, is the best example of satire. The Bat Boy stuff in the National Enquirer seems to be a little bit different, but disinformation has a more sinister motive usually behind it.
So the reason I want to draw attention to this is we are in a age where the line between entertainment and news is blurred to me, at least from my perspective. The amount of folks on screens, influencers, such and such news outlet, like there's just myriad, there's so many. And 40 years ago there was like a handful of channels and a handful of newspaper, national newspapers, so you kind of knew the game. Now there's thousands of people on screens telling you about science, medicine, health, political goings on, global events, and some are doing National Enquirer stuff, but it's not clear. And they would say in their defense, I'm just doing entertainment. There's even been some folks on large networks who have propagated outright deception and then gone to court, and they just say, oh, I'm just doing entertainment. I'm not doing news. I'm doing entertainment. So how can we tell the difference? Like, give us some coaching on the difference between entertainment and news today.
Yeah, the lines are definitely getting, more blurred. On the one hand, if you take the most traditional journalistic outlets, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, publications with clear editorial decision-making processes, it's pretty clear that those entities are not primarily there for the purposes of entertainment. Cable news is where I think you saw the lines blurred, at least, not necessarily for the first time, but in a difficult way, where you might have you might have television programs on CNN or Fox News that are sometimes of the day just going through the news headlines, interviewing people about the news, but then having shows on those networks that are commentary on the news that are designed to be a bit more entertaining. Think about Fox News, someone like Bill O'Reilly on Fox News was when he was there. He was kind of the epitome of this, right? Because he had his shtick that he would present the news of the day in a particular, in a certain kind of voice that offered his perspective on it. Stephen Colbert, when he was on Comedy Central, had his show where he, adopted a persona of sorts in going through the news. And I think it's fair to say that programs now, someone like Sean Hannity on Fox News is not the same sort of news source as a news program on Fox at like 1:00 in the afternoon, going through the stories of the day. So those lines are getting a lot more blurred. And in fact, those distinctions have come up in lawsuits, in conflicts with governments over the years. But the more prevalent sources of this, and arguably the most difficult, are, like you were saying, on social media. And, as far as coaching goes, my advice would be to take anything that you see or read on social media with an enormous grain of salt. Not because people are intentionally trying to deceive or trying to trick you into believing something that is not true, but folks on social media do not have remotely anywhere close to the same sorts of editorial or even legal burdens that news organizations have to have in order to present information. So it could be that the voice on social media is doing so in a way that, they're not trying to deceive you, but they're doing so with an obvious, with a very clear agenda. And it might be ideological. It might just be, I want to share my perspective on this issue, and so I'm going to color it in a certain way. That doesn't mean you can't listen to people on social media, but it means distinguishing the content you hear on Instagram or TikTok from more reputable news sources like the Wall Street Journal, like the New York Times, and then even reading their coverage compared to the social media coverage, and then put those things together to determine what's true and ultimately what's commentary.
Okay. That sounds wise to me. There are some of these outlets that are telling me that the other outlet is not trustworthy. And that's the outlet of those idiots over there. And I'm a smart person, Dan. And so what do I do with that? Like, how do I know who's trustworthy?
Yeah. And so this is where I do think I'll lean on the fallen nature of humanity and sin and all this. We're never going to have a perfect source of information. But this is where we can compare, contrast, draw from different wells of information. I was just having a conversation with a student this morning. She was wanting to know how she could keep up with the news of the day without being overwhelmed. And that's really hard to do, because in order to be informed in a way that you're not being misled, you're going to have to look at different sources and different voices. So by all means, look at a more right-leaning news source, but also check that with how it's being portrayed in a more left-leaning news source. So I think the examples that I've given already, with the New York Times being more, portrayed as more left-leaning, I think is fair, and the Wall Street Journal being more right-leaning is also fair. Both of those outlets have high journalistic integrity. That doesn't mean they're going to cover the same kinds of stories, or even the same stories in different ways, or in the same way, I should say. But it is incumbent on us as consumers of the news to develop and cultivate good habits for consuming this information. And oftentimes it means getting a well-balanced media diet and not becoming so reliant on one source that we end up completely neglecting the others. Yeah. Now, it does mean that this is going to be incumbent upon us to do a little bit more work in balancing the perspectives of different groups, but that's better than the alternative of just getting siloed into one perspective, I think.
Yeah. we're seeing in our congregations, households, communities, schools, workplaces across the country, people coming into real human relationships, friendships, familiar relationships, work relationships, having the evening before consumed media of news, entertainment, whatever, and then feeling totally convinced of the position that they read and consumed, and then yelling at their friends, family, loved ones, people that they love in real human life. Why are we doing that? What I'm looking for here is we consume, we get all these feelings, and then we go to our actual human relationships, which should be really meaningful to us. And then we're just yelling at each other about how wrong the other person is based on a thing we read the night before.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to, on the one hand, these are important things oftentimes. So there's been no shortage of important, salient news stories over even the past week. And when reading about these things, we sometimes even rightly become convinced of the importance of understanding what these things are, and even the importance of communicating to others the importance of these things. I think it's also become a lot more transferable in the way that we communicate or consume media on social media and digital spaces, to then think the behaviors that we have become accustomed to in those environments are then transferable to our in-person, face-to-face relationships with family, friends, people in our churches. And if I could give a piece of advice to really any American or any person, but especially a fellow Christian, is, don't yell at each other, please, over political or social disagreements. It's perfectly reasonable to say, "Hey, I read this and I saw that you think differently about that. I think that's wrong. Can you help me understand where you're coming from on this? Because I'm really struggling to see the wisdom in this."
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that you're going to be convinced, or doesn't mean that you even should be convinced about that. But seeking to have a conversation with someone with whom you disagree and saying, "Hey, man, I think and being honest, like I'm on the other side of this particular issue, right? Help me understand where you're coming from." And at the end of it, you can say, "I appreciate it. I think we're probably just in different places here, but man, let's continue to talk about other things and enjoy the meal that we're about to share together, rather than continually raising the temperature and impugning the motives of people that we're supposed to be in positive, life-giving relationships with."
But Dan,
Okay.
what if they believe something that I think could be harmful? Don't I need to change their mind at the meal?
So I think it's perfectly reasonable and in some cases admirable to think, hey, their position or their views are being, poisoned by the media that they're consuming. I've known people like this. I'm sure you know people like this. I'm sure listeners know people like this, or maybe we are people like this. The challenge, of course, is you're not going to convince a person who has developed habits, sometimes over a period of several years, over the course of a 30-minute conversation where all you're doing is yelling or demeaning them. Stop being wrong. Stop listening to that. Stop looking at that. Why are you so misled, right? There's a good word of advice on this, is someone who is what we might consider beholden to conspiracism or conspiracy thinking or misinformation. You can't logic a person out of that necessarily, especially conspiratorial thinking. There's always an explanation that can come about. So the much better example should be to cultivate a positive, continuing and lasting relationship with these folks.
Yeah.
Take down the temperature from your side and say, and if you really do care about the person, right? If you're not just seeking to prove them wrong because you need to be seen as the smart one, the adult in the room, if it's really coming from a place of care and love for that person, honestly, seeking to get them out of it immediately should be kind of far from your agenda. It should be about, let's lay the groundwork here and set myself up as someone that this person can trust and have continuing conversations with. And at the end of the day, it's kind of like sharing the gospel, Caleb. If you're trying to share the gospel with someone, not going to be super effective to be like, hey man, just read John, and I'm just going to hit you over the head with it. And how are you so stupid you can't see this? Obviously, your listener's like, well, that's not how you do it. Of course not, right? You build a relationship. You share the good news. You talk about what it means for you. Here's how I consume the news. Come back to this conversation. Here's how I read these stories. Where are we separated on this? So, man, it comes back to cultivating a long conversation. And that's harder than just yelling at someone and walk away and feeling accomplished. But if it's coming from a place of love and concern for the person, then it has to be a longer and more well thought out process.
I'm glad you brought up the good news because we're here talking about news and conspiratorial thinking and people who disagree. There are some who believe that a Jewish man 2,000 years ago died at the hand of the Roman Empire and then 3 days later rose from the grave. And then there's people who are propagating that idea. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, Dan. And there are many others who say that's a conspiracy. It was the original followers, they hid his body, and we're still having a debate today over, is that true or not? And that, for me at least, as a pastor who believes option A in those two options, it's hard for me to get my head around how to engage folks who are drawn to conspiratorial thinking in the church, given that I believe in something that many people throughout human history have called a conspiracy. I think Dallas Willard didn't even call it the
divine conspiracy, yeah,
which is a great title.
It's great.
I think from the 80s, though. I wonder if he would have named it that today. You're an option A guy also. How can we cling to, right, this belief that Jesus rose from the grave, which many people think is conspiratorial, and still cultivate non-conspiratorial thinking in our congregations, in our churches, in our faith communities?
Yeah. When I was in high school, that was a question that I wrestled with a lot. I was raised in the church, and like I think a lot of people, when they hit their teenage years, they started to have intellectual development and think, well, this seems kind of silly. This seems kind of far-fetched. And my youth pastor at the time was really into apologetics and introduced me to some books and talks. And that was the kind of material that I needed in that moment to, talking about the disciples, well, they hid their body, the response of, or they hid the body and they made it all up. They also went to their deaths as a result. And that's difficult to account for, as you're being crucified upside down, to say, well, at least I misled a lot of people.
Right.
Probably not. So there's that side of it, right? But then there's also the side of it that, I think we as people of faith can be, there's going to be doubts as people of faith. Faith itself involves a degree of doubting or a degree of uncertainty, even among, the most faithful in our communities. But this is where the work of the Spirit comes in too, right? When we're sharing the good news with others, it's not just here's the facts about Jesus. Here's how you can believe the Bible is reliable, and you can believe these things, right? Because I do think it's reliable. But then we also speak about the ways in which Jesus has affected us personally, right? The ways in which we've seen the Spirit work in our lives, and the ways that we've encountered the living God, and these kinds of things. But the most important thing for connecting it back to your question of how do we be people of the truth when we ourselves believe in something that a lot of people would dismiss as completely untrue, is that we can be confident in it. We believe that all truth is ultimately God's truth. And so we should cultivate a value for what is true in our consumption of the world around us. That should lead us to a degree of confidence. Not that we're always going to be right, but we can say, well, if this thing is true, that's kind of inconvenient for me politically or personally, or if it is true, in fact, that this candidate won the election fair and square, that's bad for my political agenda. But I can also be confident that this is not the most important thing in the world. That I know, even in spite of threats and concerns that I might have about our political environment, that I know how the story ultimately ends, the big story. And so we can cultivate a value and love for the truth because we believe that all truth ultimately is God's truth. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, right? He's the way to the Father. He gives us eternal, his death on the cross gives us life, but he is truth. He is embodiment of ultimate truth. And so we can be confident in that as we seek to understand the world around us, knowing that seeking him will lead us to truth in other ways.
That's good. So we also recognize in those relationships that the way of Jesus calls us to reconciliation and to healed relationships. And we see that misinformation, disinformation, entertainment media, conspiratorial, many of them propagating what I think are conspiratorial, that's generating suspicion in our communities, in our families. It's generating division. People are yelling and screaming and ending relationships over how they think about something they don't know anything about. They've just been told how to feel about it. So many of us are even thinking through, how do I help people mend those divisions? Would you give us some coaching on it for people in our lives that are wrapped up in this stuff and it's causing real world, human embodied division, not just online yelling? How can we go about the work of mending those divisions?
Well, I think a lot of the work has to begin with ourselves, looking internally to think, what is my motivation for wanting to, connect with this person, or if the relationship has taken a negative turn, why do I want to mend this relationship? Hopefully it's for good reasons, right? And hopefully it's not just because I want to prove that I'm smarter than them, or I want to prove that they're wrong and lord that over them. But let's just assume that we have good motives, right? So there's a few things, right? On the one hand, it does mean building long-term, it does mean doing the work to build trust with that person. It could be very short initial conversations. If this is a relationship that's been harmed in the past, to say, hey, I know that we've had some tough times lately. I'd like to try to start to mend this, and I want to know what I can do on my end to help that. And maybe that's not possible for that person in the moment. You can continue to put yourself out there, but if it is, you might need to meet that person where they are. And it's well, I'd really like you to explore this thing that I'm really interested in. And so maybe that's going to be work for you to say, okay, well, I got to read some stuff that I think is a little weird and a little bonkers, but this is something that has shaped this person's, worldview in a certain way. And that becomes a sort of a jumping off point for, you continuing to ask questions about that. Well, okay, the thing that you sent me made me, consider this. Have you considered the possibility of X? Or why is this? And this is maybe the most important question to ask someone like that who is in the midst of conspiratorial thinking is, why is this so important to you? Not in a accusatory way, but help me understand why this is such an important thing for you. Because for me, and you can be honest, for me, it isn't. And I just want to know where you're at on this. And if you're coming at it from a place of genuine, either concern, certainly love, but also just curiosity, I think that person's going to sense that and be more willing to open up rather than from the perspective of, why are you such a weirdo? Tell me why you're drawn into this nonsense. So with any maintenance of a relationship, if you're in a marriage, if you have children, it's going to involve just a lot of conversation and building rapport and trust with that person. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be challenges. It's going to be hard. But again, if it's from a motivation of wanting to maintain, repair, and build a healthy relationship, you are going to need to be the first mover, most likely. And that's going to require you to do some work to meet the person where they are, ask good questions, be willing to listen, and not immediately seek to tear down, but seek to understand for the purpose of laying the groundwork for those future conversations when you can start to say, here's where I think you might be a little mistaken. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's good. Thinking a little bit bigger than one-on-one, pastors in America are still, according to surveys I've read, one of the more trusted folks in people's lives. How can pastors help in this space?
Pastors have a really difficult job in today's political and cultural environment. There's a pressure to respond to salient issues, and they're kind of in a lose-lose situation. If they do respond, they can alienate people in the congregation. If they don't respond, they alienate people in the congregation. So I think for pastors, I think it really does come back to keeping, is a very church answer, I'm sorry, Caleb, keeping the main thing in pastors' preaching and in their shepherding the congregations. Not downplaying topics when they're controversial because you think you might alienate people in your congregation, but also not leaning into whatever the big thing of the day is because you think you want to try to wedge it into your sermon that given Sunday. Yeah. So don't be pressured by the political environment around you. If you're going to be pressured by anything, be pressured by your commitment to care and shepherd for the people in your congregation. Similarly to that, pastors have a unique role and opportunity in directly communicating with people who are really struggling in a variety of ways, including in sometimes social media silos and echo chambers. And so for pastors, y'all have the opportunity to reach people as individuals, not as masses of faces in the digital space. So, being on the lookout and being aware of those divisions when they're arising in the congregation, asking, someone to go to coffee or grabbing lunch and saying, hey, man, tell me a little bit about this. I noticed that, maybe you follow them on social media. I noticed that you were saying some stuff about this. I've heard about this story. I'd be curious to get your perspective on it. Yeah. And kind of almost like as a preemptive form of shepherding and care, right? I told you before we started recording, I don't envy being a pastor right now. This is a really difficult job to do, but it's also an incredibly important one in the culture that we're in. Yeah. So for pastors, it really does come back to not being tempted to respond to every big issue, but also not downplaying stuff that you feel convicted to speak into as someone committed to the truth.
So as we kind of land the plane, you created a bit of curriculum to help churches and really anybody, but specifically I think followers of Jesus, step into this space bringing healing. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's been a few years now, but it's still pretty relevant. Honestly, it's probably more relevant than ever. Created some content through Mending Division Academy. And my particular course was on misinformation and conspiracy theory. So we get into the social and psychological science behind what's appealing about conspiratorial thinking, why it's not a new phenomenon at all, why we're drawn to these kinds of things, why we're drawn to misinformation, particularly ones that affirm what we already believe to be true about the world. And how we as people can recognize those tendencies, certainly in ourselves, but also recognize when our family and friends are, potentially getting caught up in this, and what we can do about it in helpful, loving ways rather than confrontational and conflictual ways. So you can go to Mending Division Academy. If you find my course, it's called When Conspiracies Divide Us, and I think there's a coupon code you can use for that. If you enter the coupon code Daniel20, it'll give you 20% off the curriculum. And you can use it in a variety of ways for small groups, for individuals, church groups, campus groups, if you're in a college environment. But Mending Division Academy, there's a lot of other interesting courses there that speak to some of these challenges.
Nice. Cool. Daniel, thank you so much for being with us today and for helping us think through this really important topic.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Caleb.